Benvenute e benvenuti.
Welcome to you all to the first lesson of this course, which will focus on the great challenges, the ones we're experiencing, and the great challenges which await us in the near and distant future. My name is Telmo Pievani. I teach at the Department of Biology of the University of Padua, and I am a strange hybrid. I am involved in the philosophy of science, that is to say, in the theoretical aspects of sciences, and I'm also involved in life sciences, biology, biotechnology. I also teach ethics at biology at my university. But I'm also an evolutionary biologist, so I study the processes of change. I study in particular human evolution, both from a biological point of view and from a cultural point of view. My job is that of recreating models, that is to say, putting together a lot of data that come from different aspects, genetics, paleontology, or whatever, disciplines that study the past, history, putting all the data together, sometimes they're big data, very big data, and then make hypotheses and compare models. Now, my task in these 4 lessons will be that of accompanying you within the history of these great challenges and try to suggest an understanding and reading into these changes, both from the point of view of theories, not only in abstract but also in practice and how it's implemented, but also from an evolutionary point of view, transformation, helping us to understand what is happening and what type of dynamics are developing. Why should I share this with you? You're engineers, you're studying engineering after all, because you will be working in engineering. Well, I will be talking a lot about engineering, but from an unusual point of view. That is to say, our bodies, we human beings and other bodies, although we're not engineers, we are engineered systems. And then a lot of what is happening depends on this. And then we will be talking also about technology and how technologies evolve over time. But first of all, I would like to observe it from the evolutionary point of view. I was thinking I thought of entitling this, so we change the world and then the world changes us. So it's a recursive title. That is to say, we change and then we are changed. And then I would focus on this first notion of recursiveness with a very practical example. I will dividing my lessons in chapters. This is the weight of things, and I will focus on various aspects. I will be talking about various papers which are easily found through the university website, and then I will be focusing on some case studies. The first paper I will be using is the one which was published a few months ago on Nature. I will be really mentioning papers that have been published on international journals which are peer-reviewed. Now, this is a paper that was the beginning of a long discussion, and I was very interested in it. You can see from the heading, it says that the global human-made mass exceeds all living biomass. That is to say, the mass of all living beings and things. The first mass, the human-made mass, is the mass of things that are made by humans, roads, dams, means of transport, but also furnishings, our life, what we use, the tools, computers, the stool I'm sitting on, all the sort of materials that are available, all the ones that you want, excluding from this calculation what we no longer use, therefore waste and rubbish. But imagine that you are able to weigh all human artifacts, all the things that have been produced by human intelligence. How they managed to do that is something you can discover if you read the paper. They used satellite imaging, they used different weighing systems, sample weighing, then they multiplied, for example, unit weights such as the weight of a building. We're using then the data banks that are available, and it's very complicated calculation. It took them years to do it. And what did they discover? discover? Well, that we knew this really, that the calculation was also done in a dynamic historical manner. So how much the mass of all we produce has increased since the 1900s, the beginning of the 1900s to the year 2000. You see, it's very slow increase at the beginning, and then after World War II, suddenly there is an acceleration in growth, and it's virtually exponential. But the fact which really has to draw our attention is that red dot. That is to say, what happened in 2020, the year of the pandemic. Well, as you can see, the black line, the one of the anthropogenic line, the human-made mass, crosses and exceeds the green line, that is to say, the line of all the living biomass. We already knew that the value of the weight of all living beings on Earth. So you can imagine that there's a big pile with all the plants, the animals, and also all the viruses, the microbes, the bacteria. It's an enormous mass, and we have known for a time that it corresponds to roughly 1.1 teratons, 1,100 billion tons. You can see that the mass here, the mass of all the human-made objects, has exceeded the living biomass. This is a first. This, for me, is probably the most direct manner to understand what Anthropocene is. This definition that has been used for a while now. It means the geological era dominated by humans. You know that it is a term that was introduced more than 20 years ago by Paul Crutzen, who is a Nobel Prize for chemistry, who died not so long ago, great scientist, and who had investigated ozone, the percentage of the ozone layer in the stratosphere. You're very young, so you don't remember all the debate that there was a few years ago on the ozone hole on the Antarctic, saying that it was thinning out, and this meant that all the ultraviolet rays would hit the Earth, and they cause mutagenesis. So they understood how this layer was formed, what happened, and he understood that there were some gases, in particular CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that in the stratosphere would thin out the ozone layer, and this also enabled us to find a solution which is described in the Montreal Agreement. In Mexico, in the year 2000, they were discussing about geological eras, a human impact. Even at that time, they were talking about climate change and environmental problems. He said, let's stop talking about Pleistocene, Miocene, Holocene, all these names which geological eras have. Our era is Anthropocene, that is to say, the geological era determined by human beings. This had not yet a statute because it hadn't been introduced in the official definitions, but there is an international committee debating it, and those of you who, well, in fact, those who are a bit younger than you will have in their books the Anthropocene listing. They haven't yet decided because they haven't agreed yet on when it should start, whether it should start in 1945 after the atomic bomb or a long time before with agriculture, animal husbandry, and so on, with other times in the past where humans were able to deeply modify the land, the landscape, for example, boring holes in mountains, channeling rivers, changing the coastline, changing the gaseous content of the air. This is the Anthropocene. That is to say, when human beings, through their intellectual work, are able to modify the landscape, change the world around them. But here we see that there's something new. That is to say, Anthropocene has a long evolution, and we will discuss it in a moment. But here you can see that in the past decades, something has happened. Can you see that acceleration, what we call the Great Acceleration? And if you really want to do it, I've included this amongst the bibliography I gave you, but you see this is very important also for your work. For example, there's a breaking down of all the materials that make up this human-made mass. We have cement, then we have bricks, in all types of bricks. So then we have asphalt, in particular after World War II, and then with the very small percentages, glass, wood, plastic, obviously, metals, and so on and so forth. All the other materials. It's very, very interesting. And it's very, very interesting also to see the breakdown of the biomass, where you discover that 90% of all the living mass is plants. Ours is a planet of plants. 10% are microbes and viruses, so one single cell organisms, and then a very small slice is made up of animals, and we are 0.01 of the living biomass. So 0.01 of living beings have been able to produce a mass that exceeds that of all the living beings. In this paper, there's also a suggestion for a series of other visualizations. I'm going to show you some, and then we will discuss some more further on, because these scientists, my colleagues, have also got a new website. Here you can see it. It's very simple, not using special technical terms, where you can see a comparison. Here you can see these are quite amusing. I think it's quite impressive. You'll find, for instance, in 2020, if you weigh on a balance, if you put on a weighing scale all the plastic that we have produced and disseminated in the environment, and put all the other animals, you see that plastic now exceeds animals' weight. And there's another one, which is of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which I suggest. Again, it has a very good website. If we go on like this in the next year of next years to come, to leaving or putting so much plastic into the environment, which in the end goes into the sea, in 2050 there will be more plastic than fish in terms of weight. And that's really plastics will exceed fish in weight. And here you can see there's a visualization, and down below you see that all the buildings, whatever type of buildings, dwellings, industrial plants, everything has exceeded the mass of all the trees and shrubs put together. And another one, already now, the mass of all the fish in the sea is the equivalent of the weight of the city of New York. So New York weighs as much as all the fish in the sea. And then you see another one, which is pretty sad on the right. That is to say, if you have all the white rhinos and you weigh them, there are only about 10,000 white rhinos left. They weigh as much as the Eiffel Tower. So you can have fun. You can visualize different weights and measures, calculating the anthropogenic masses. And now that you have this figure, that you have this immersion, and it's very clear, we are philosophers of science. It's just a description. We just put data. But then data have to be interpreted. And this is a first suggestion that I am going to give you. This is quantitative science. Very important. Having models, analyzing, have the facts and figures, being able to weigh things, compare man-made objects and artifacts to the biomass. But there is a message, and you have to interpret. You have to decide what it means. And let's see what the interpretation of data is. By interpreting, you can generalize things. What does that mean? How can we interpret data? This is the qualitative part of science that you should never forget, because it's as important. Big data on their own, without the questions, without deciding, what am I looking for? What does it mean? What is my aim? What is my question underlying all of this? Big data on their own don't mean anything, and observation doesn't mean anything in itself. Maybe, possibly, the data will disprove your initial hypothesis. Maybe you will have to change it. You will have to fine-tune it. But this is also the importance of Italian science. Italian science is famous the world over because we're able to understand the questions that underlie it. We must maintain this tradition. We're very proud of it. Let's see now how to do this with this paper. I'm going to suggest an interpretation which is an evolutionary interpretation. That's my job. I'm an evolutionist, and I'm going to show you. Here you can see. This is an interpretation of what you have just seen with those data. We change the world, that changes us. So here, we, for a long time, have been transforming the natural world for our goals, human, industrial, whatever, building. Sometimes our goals might be spiritual. For example, the architecture in having built cathedrals and churches or wars. They're very different goals. The Great Chinese Wall, great works of engineering that the future will enjoy too, that you can see from the outer space too. All this is not recent. It started a long time ago, and it's a technique to survive. There are other animals, other organisms that do this. That is to say, they don't simply wait for the world around them to change and for them to adapt to this change. They do something else. They also do something else. That is to say, they actively, transformatively, with a project in the human idea, maybe not with animals, they change the world. This is a beaver dam. A beaver dam is an intellectual work. You use technology, we call it like that. They have a technological culture. Beavers do. We know that beavers do it for their own need to survive. It becomes a safe place, so where they can build a lodge or bank den. And by deviating, by rechanneling the water, they create a still water area, and this helps their survival. And it means that they can find more food. Survival, so seeing that people or other animals will not eat you, and maximize the resources available so you can maximize the transmission of your genes. Beavers do this actively. They build something. What happens? Well, the beavers change the world to adapt it to its needs, but also they generate ecological niches, that is to say, an environmental condition which is new, which becomes a new environment for other species. So in the picture you can see here, there are other animals and plants that adapt to the new environment that has been changed by beavers. This is why we say that beavers, this is just an example, one as many, is an engineer. In particular, the beavers are ecosystem engineers. They actively modify the environment to tailor it to its needs. We human beings are the champions of the world. We are the champions of environmental engineering, of this process, which technically is called niche construction. That is to say, you build your own niche. I say that some living beings, we are some of the most important in this respect, have an active, transformative attitude to the environment. And this is not a value judgment in any way. When we go over the evolution, we never say as scientists, this is right, this is wrong. These are value judgments which possibly one can make, but the important thing is to understand what happened and to analyze things from an evolutionary point of view. But if nothing else, and this we're sure of, this is a very ambivalent process. That is to say, it has given us humans enormous advantages, and we have to be very honest on this point of view. Great development, the possibility of using active principles in nature to modify things, to synthesize them, to engineer them, to produce drugs, antibiotics, nearly all from the substances in nature. We know vaccines, anesthesia, and everything, the technology which made it possible for us to do things, especially from mid-1800s. This technological and engineering progress, which so far has only advantaged part of humanity, so we could also discuss how and who had access to it. This niche construction underlies our progress, and we're strongly linked to human intelligence in that. But as I will show you, this niche construction has also a flip side, the negative side, the other side. And this is why it is a technique which I call ambivalent. I've termed it as an ambivalent one. And we will be discussing this also in the lessons to come. Recently, COP26 was held, the international meeting where they spoke about climate and how we could act against climate change. And you saw that there were two key words to discuss what we had to do to fight or at least slow down climate change. One is mitigation, which means to try and buffer the effects, to mitigate them, to slow the effects of the climate change. But the other one is adaptation. The word adaptation is something which comes from my field, that is to say, from evolution. That is to say that the process which we're now part of, which we're experiencing, such as the average temperature increase is 1.1, 1.2, and we will reach 1.5 higher degrees centigrade. But this process, I was saying, even if we are able to mitigate it, we will in any case have to adapt to it. So you see that evolution is very important. Evolution counts. The word evolution is something that has entered the topics that many of you will have to work on when you have environmental changes, climate changes, and so on. This is why evolution is a very important lens, because it also enables you to expand the sphere of your understanding. This is another point I'd like to make. When you have these global challenges, they have dangers but are also opportunities. Always try and expand your point of view. Don't focus on details. Try and understand what are the deep roots from the past. Project into the future. Don't make forecasts, but see what scenarios might take place in the future, and then expand your gaze to the future, because challenges are great, big, and for the future, because they concern the entire planet and over time. So analyze things from an evolutionary systemic point of view. You can choose an image, whatever image. I've chosen this one. This is the famous one of the polar bear, as you know, floating on a bit of ice. It's a real photograph. It's dramatic because, in particular in the Arctic, we know that there are 3 or 4 degrees above average in the temperature, and it'd be very difficult for these animals to survive. But in fact, once again, let us not have an emotional reaction to this, because if we want to fully understand and fight the problem and do something, we have to rationally approach it and understand it. From an evolutionary point of view, climate change is a great experiment of niche construction for thousands of years, not only from the Industrial Revolution, but even from time immemorial when we invented agriculture. We've learned how to do this. That is to say, we've learned how to modify climate, to change the rules of the game. The great game of regulation of the earth. Very dangerous for some species, like the polar bear, that will not survive. Why? Well, and this is very important, and we will come back on it. Climate change, which is underway now, is not per se very different from what has happened in the past if we look at it from a distance. Climate has changed many times in the past. The Earth was warmer, but we're talking about the past tens and hundreds of years ago, millions of years ago. There was more CO2, less CO2. It was warmer, it was colder. If you look at the maps of Italy of millions of years ago, Italy was wider, narrower, warmer, colder. Climate change per se is a normal part of evolution. And we human beings are here because we survived adapting to major climate change of the past. But, and there is a big, big but here, there are two elements that are new and that are the hallmark of what you've seen now and which you saw in that sharp increase in the graph. First of all, climate change is for the first time caused by the activities of one species, never in the past. Climate changed because of reasons that were astronomical, linked to the drift of the continents or the overall balance of this planet, and so on and so forth. Nowadays, instead, the cause is called Homo sapiens. Second new element, which is again very important, never before now has a climate change, and we know it is evolutionary because scientists, because this is what we study, never had it been so fast. We had never had a mass extinction such as the one we've had in a few centuries, 5, 6 centuries. Say even that you consider it from the discovery of agriculture, it's 10 millennia, nothing in the scope of things. The last big climate change that led to a catastrophe took 300,000 years to develop. That is to say, all the dynamics took 300,000 years, while we're doing all of this in but a few decades, but a few centuries. This is a completely different time scale, and you can see it. You can see it because nature hasn't got recovery time, hasn't got the time to recover and adapt, because we talk about resilience and recovery, which is very important. But in this case, nature has not enough time to adapt to a change that is so fast. But, again, another but, this concerns us. And let me show you a few things. This is an image of what we call urbanization, not an easy word. It's the strategy that other animals are finding to adapt to human niches, the anthropogenic niches. And you can see with a degree of imagination, even with a certain unexpected speed, these animals find new opportunities, new food, nesting sites, places where they can nest or develop a den. Evolution is an opportunistic trend. If there's an empty space, they fill it. We're already nearly forgetting it, but think what happened during the first lockdown from March, April, June of 2020. My colleagues, etologists, were really surprised. They didn't expect this. They discovered that wild animals were reconquering their spaces much faster than they had expected. That is to say, the water of the rivers was cleaner, the air was cleaner when suddenly we stopped and locked down. That was a big, dramatic experiment of evolution, a bit cynical really, because it was very expensive in many ways, but it was an incredible experiment. Humanity locking up, humanity slowing down once in a while, and see what happens. So now there are a lot of papers that are going to be published discussing what has happened and what type of recovery there was. But then we started again faster than ever, and above all, if we go and see the overall data, it's quite impressive, and it's linked to that anthropogenic aspect I was talking about. During 2020, the year when we stopped and we locked down, we had a drop of 4% of emissions, but we only earned a month in that calculation that we do every year as to when we use all the resources and then exceed them for the year. So we should really think about things carefully. Now, this is another image I'd like to show you because it concerns pandemics. We will be talking about this in another lesson because That'll be mainly on pandemics and this other one. But this slide was something I was using in 2016 and 2017, before this last pandemic, which burst out in China at the end of 2019. Now, why were you doing this? We were doing with David Quammen, who wrote this book, which I suggest that you read, called Spillover, which is the interspecies jumping by viruses. We already had the data. We already had the models. And what did the data and the models tell us? They told us that by changing the world and, for example, deforestation, illegal trade of exotic animals, replacement of Indonesia, in Africa and in South America, of replacement of forests with crops, or, for example, more animal husbandry, so on and so forth, or the wet markets, which are in themselves, they're ecological niches. There are places where you mix together lots of different animals that belong to very different species, fish, birds, mammals, flying mammals, bats, pangolins, and you mix them all together, live and dead. And then people who are working there, clients, they touch, they take them, they transport them, they take them home. What happens? What do you expect? When we build ecological niches like this, we have to expect effects from that. That is to say, we have to expect that other creatures would take advantage of it. In this case, the viruses will take advantage of it. What's the virus's job? Well, they don't do anything else. They replicate using other species cells. They're parasites. They're forced parasites. If I put all this together, what happens? That is the risk of spillover, the risk of zoonosis, which is the technical term, that is to say of a disease which comes from another species, another animal species, will cause great damage, which is what happened with the pandemic. So, we don't always think about it, but our changing the world also changes others' ecological niches, like the beavers. And this sometimes can be very dangerous for us, that is to say, for the ecosystemic engineering, because it increases the possibility of a pandemic. End of chapter 1. That is to say, the weight of things is something which I defined as the type of approach that we have, developing models, evolutionary models, which can then be used by those who study technology, the climate, evolution, and by those who study pandemics, and so on and so forth. Now, very briefly, I'm going to suggest a few aspects which you can develop in more detail, and you can choose which ones. Let us move on to our history. We are the niche builders. I'll give you a few examples. And a few examples that are amusing, because there's also that to be considered. This is a very interesting paper on Nature. I suggest that you should read it. It's a review. It's not very technical. It's a review, which means that it has articles from others or by others. It was published a few years ago. What does it talk about? It talks about a discovery, and I marginally took part in it because this is the work that we do in my university on the analysis of molecular data. It's the evolution of milk. We discovered where, how, and why animal herders came to Europe. Here you can see this map. I would like to dwell upon this map because it's very beautiful, and we will see how we will do it. Because when you explain science, you always have to explain the results. But above all, we have to explain the processes, how you manage to produce these maps. Now, we know that around 7,000 years ago, Europe was invaded, so to speak. There was a migration from the Near East. They're the famous Neolithic civilizations. They had a technology. Don't forget that animal husbandry and agriculture are great technologies. In fact, they are families of technologies, because it means let me reword it. It means that ecosystems produce a surplus of something. It could be the fruits, the seeds of a tree, or an produce of an animal, more than would happen in nature. So it is you have to find an artificial selection that will make it possible to modify the ecosystem. This was the Neolithic civilization. This is what they'd learned how to do. Round about 7,500 years ago in Central Europe and then Scandinavia, and in the area that you can see here, the darker area, there were also strange objects that archaeologists have discovered, artifacts. Again, you see that this is a research where genetic experts, historians, and archaeologists blend together. In spite of the fact that they do something very different. Interdisciplinary sciences is the key to science in the future. The most beautiful works and papers that emerge in my areas are interdisciplinary, where people and scientists from very different areas pool their data and they try to produce an explanation, and I suggest that in your future career too, you should favor interdisciplinary teams because you should look at the same problem but from different angles, using a different language, because you will have unexpected discoveries too. In any case, various people, various scientists worked together on this, and they discovered these objects. For example, they were vessels and vases, and we discovered that they were used for milk, so that they had got milk and then cheese. Why am I talking about this? Because it's very strange from an evolutionary point of view, because we're mammals, and as all mammals, we cannot digest milk as adults. In mammals, what happens? That when they're weaned and when they're nursed, we digest meat. It's the mother's milk. Sorry, we digest milk, mother's milk. But then there is a mechanism which is linked to a gene that controls a protein called lactase, and lactase is the enzyme which then makes it possible for you to digest milk. And at one point it just switches off after weaning. And thereafter, if you drink milk, it's a sort of intoxication. It bothers you. You don't die of it, of course, but in the most severe cases, you can have very negative reactions. So how did this happen? We learned how animal husbandry. We understood that we had animals that produce meat and milk, and this is a cultural change. It's a technological change. Nature has nothing to do with it. We did it. We changed this. Well, in that map, you can see in that genetic map that in 3 parts of the world, in that period between sort of 7, 8, and 5,000 years ago, it depends on the area, a genetic mutation started to determine an increase in the lactase enzyme being produced during adulthood. You see that there are various gradients, the various colors. What does this map tell us? Well, it tells us that in 3 different parts of the world, in Europe, in Western Africa, and in the Arabian Peninsula, there was a genetic mutation which meant that some of our ancestors were able to digest milk as adults. It meant that the production of the lactase enzyme continued throughout the human's life, and then at a certain point it switches off. We don't even know. For example, personally, round about 35 and 40, while I used to be able to drink milk, at a certain point it started bothering me, and I was no longer able to drink milk or have dairy products. It's called an epigenetic mechanism, but I'm not going to talk about that. But think about it. If you look at this map, what has happened? Well, first of all, culture changed. First, the technology changed, animal husbandry and so on. Then you had a genetic mutation. And it's not that technology induced the genetic mutation. It's not Lamarck. No, it's Darwinian process. At a certain point, there was milk. They understood that that milk was very nourishing and gave a great advantage. Those who by chance already had the mutation, which meant that they could digest milk for a longer period of time, had a great evolutionary advantage, which meant they had more offspring, and that slowly this mutation spread, because that is how Darwinian evolution develops. It's a random or mutation which then it gives an advantage, and a random mutation that gives an advantage spreads because it means that the person will reach adulthood more easily, will have more offspring, and so on. This, in a nutshell, is an explanation of Darwinism. And here you can see it, but you can also see it where first there was a technological change, which was followed by a genetic one. We could say, if we were to push it a bit, is that in a Darwinian way, the technology changed our genetic makeup. You might say, well, these things happen very rarely. It's a very particular case. Well, we know that this, in fact, happens very often. Here you see there are some white areas. The white areas are native populations which still exist. For example, the Kalahari hunters and some Indo-Chinese population where the mutation does not exist because clearly milk and dairy products spread, but no one developed the lactase enzyme mutation. So it's rather random, and it's which is a hallmark of evolution. And I'd like to add one more thing here. You see another important thing: global challenges, great challenges. This is a process which concerns the entire world, but which you can visualize through geography, through maps. Maps and geography are very important when studying evolution. Very often we think that the evolution happens only over time, and clearly it does happen over time. Generation changes, evolutions, but in fact space is as important as time. Geography is very important, understanding dislocation, evolution, how populations are distributed, movement of plants, genetic gradients, all of these are keys to understanding evolution. So use maps, because they will help you understand a lot. And now I'm just going to move on a bit because we will be discussing some aspects in more detail in other lessons. Here you can see this is a summary of the niche construction. You will observe how on the right, basically, you have the biological population which transfers, or that transfers its gene, and you have a genetic inheritance. Normal. On the left, you have the environment, which has a natural selection. But you see that then there is an arrow that also goes from right to left. That is the niche construction. These are all changes that organisms introduce through architecture, engineering, technology, culture, you name it, modifies the world, and then what happens? Well, these modifications, these ecological and cultural modifications, are transmitted to the next generation. It's ecological inheritance. So what does this mean in practice? It means that we today, when we have children and grandchildren, what do you pass on? Well, clearly we pass on our genes, mixed mother and father, but we pass them on. Then our ideas, culture, education, we send them to school or we don't. So we transfer a cultural baggage. But there's one more thing, the third leg. That is to say, we also pass the ecological changes that we introduced in our generation. So you are, for example, a native of a world which is different from the one where I was born. I am a digital migrant, not a native digital. And you're also a climate native, a climate changing native. The way in which you act was shaped right from the beginning by different experiences. These are these changes are called ecological inheritance. So what is happening now? That this ecological inheritance is no longer necessarily positive. That is to say, I'm transferring to my children an environment that is less stable, more difficult to manage, more dangerous in certain respects, and therefore I'm transferring a misadaptation. So what is going to happen? That my children will have more difficulties than I have, and this is linked to that ecological transference. A historical overview, if you are interested in it, once again, because he invented a lot of things, but the person who understood this mechanism first was called Charles Darwin, the father of the evolutionary theory, in a rather unusual way. Just before he died in 1881, he died then in 1882, published a book on earthworms. In fact, I suggest that if you have time, read it. So 6 months before his death, he published it. And he spoke about earthworms and how they acted, but he illustrated 2 points. He said, observe these animals. They are an example of how summing lots of small, infinitely small and insignificant actions, you can change the world. That is to say, how the very many small actions, like the worms do, you can change the world. How do you do it? Because, for example, the worms form the humus, and they also form the upper layer, which is part of the ground, which is part of the British landscape, and they shape the landscape. They're engineers of the landscape. They're architects of the landscape. And then he details this and explains how it also affects different species, including human agriculture and human activities. So he had been the one who had understood the idea that we and other living beings were ecosystemic engineers. This is a curiosity, an experiment that he carried out to understand how science worked. Darwin wanted to measure their activity, and he put this very round stone, and he measured how long it took for it to sink into the ground, thanks to the work of the earthworms. So the time required. Here you can see the definition of niche construction. All these slides are in English, and I'm sure that you will be able to follow them. Organisms play 2 roles in evolution. They carry genes, and this is well understood. And then they interact with their environments and they modify them. And then this means, and this is not so well understood, this means that you move on to niche construction, which is the notion I described earlier on. As I mentioned, many animals are niche builders, earthworms, beavers, but also the very big sequoias or redwoods. They become an ecological niche for many other organisms, insects, all the ones that build, all the beings that build dens or termites that build termite hills. These are all animals or beings that change the world. And if we want to be more exact, we would not be here. We couldn't breathe oxygen if 2 billion years ago organisms called cyanobacteria had not invented, so to speak, photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, as you know, is a biochemical miracle. One of the side effects of which is to create oxygen. So it reached 15, 16, 20, 21% of the atmosphere. And thereafter, other organisms learned how to use oxygen to breathe. I would like to remind you, but you know this through chemistry, oxygen per se is a poison for living beings. It seems absurd to say it, but it generates instability. So it's very difficult to manage for a living being. And in this way, oxygen is breathed in and becomes a resource, while previously all other beings were anaerobic and they lived in places where there was no oxygen. But while we are part of the beings that use oxygen to live. So thanks to the niche builders or the niche construction of the past, we now can breathe. This is a niche construction. I'm going to just show you this. I'm not going to explain it in detail, but basically it means that all the transmission mechanisms are very complex. If you consider them and you consider all these aspects, it's very difficult, but you will find papers on it. And here you can see consequences and implications of niche construction. I'm not going to again read the details, but if you're interested, you can go and look it up. But what is interesting is that biological species are ecosystem engineers, and then they have to adapt to a world that they themselves have modified with ambivalent effects, two-sided effects. Basically, here you see this mechanism of transmission. You will also observe how all the activities, cultural activities, technological activities can contribute to this type of mechanism. I would also like to mention the fact that we're not the only ones to have culture. In fact, here you can see that there are different species, different animals that have invented tools. For example, the famous finches of the Galapagos that use a little branch to go and fish for insects in the cacti. This is a technology, or the chimps that have learned how to use a stone, a flat stone, and another stone, because it's like a mortar and pestle, and they can break certain seeds that they really love. That's a technology. And it's culture, because then they teach it to others. And this is not trivial. It means that the cubs, the babies, the offspring, according to the species, look at it, they try to come to do it. No one has taught them genetically. It's not written into their DNA, but this is called a cultural technological tradition, which exists in animals as well. And by the way, just a curiosity, there's a video online where you can see it. Sometimes it's the young adults like you who invent an innovation, a technological and cultural innovation that is then copied by the older ones. There was a case that was studied by Frans de Waal, a great ethologist, that observed this scene in nature. There's a group of chimpanzees who live in nature, so they're not in captivity. And at one point, there's a young chimp, by chance, was in the right place, but had the idea, a genius in fact, they're trying to break these very hard-shelled nuts, and they can't do it, but at one point, this youngster finds this stone, which was the right-shaped stone, and starts hammering it and manages to break the seeds. And all the adults start looking at this youngster and envious. And they want to copy the invention, but it's not so easy because there are not that many technological tools. So at that point, a female, maybe its mother, and asks for grooming. And grooming is a demand an adult can make. While the youngster doesn't want to groom its mother, it doesn't really want to go and groom her. But she insists, "You must groom me," she seems to say. And so at that point, the youngster starts grooming, and the female at that point takes the stone and she starts breaking the nuts. This means that these animals not only have culture and technology, but also what we call design, a planned action. It means you do something because you expect a reaction, and then you do something, which is a type of intelligence of a species that then develops a culture and technology. But you also know that there is a mystery, an enigma in evolution. That is to say that no animal species that we know so far, unless disproved, knows how to build a tool starting from another tool. This is the human secret. As far as we know, to the best of our knowledge, this is what happens. Understanding that with that tool, you can make another tool. It's called recursiveness, and it is a key strategy in what we call technological culture. It's really grammar in our mind, what we call a grammar, that is to say, rules that govern evolution. Here you can see another very famous case, which is of these Japanese monkeys, and you can see that at a certain point the females see they love these potatoes, and they discover that when they clean it, they discover that if they go close to the sea, the potatoes were then nicer. They're sweet potatoes because they were clean. And then tasting them, they also discover that if you dip them in water again, the sweet potato is nicer. So they start peeling them, and then they bite them, and then they dip them in salty water. And you see that the others start copying this technology, and at that point it becomes a discovery which is called a tradition, a technological tradition, a cultural tradition. So only the monkeys of that group know how to do it, and they pass it on to the young of their group, while the monkeys from another group have not learnt it. So it is that culture and technology which changes the world. This is another very interesting example. It's science, it's a cover science. And once again, I'm not going to detail it, but it's the discovery that even migration in these ungulates is not genetically determined, but it is culturally transmitted. So it is a form of social learning. So if you take this animal and you take them somewhere else, they will teach in a different way their young how to migrate. It's a very beautiful discovery, but it also means that if I move these animals, or if the environment changes too quickly because of climate change, they might find it very difficult because they don't recognize what it is. But since it is a cultural trait, they might relearn it or change it, because we know that technology and culture, as compared to genes, change much more rapidly. We will see this in lesson 4. Here you can see the global warming. This is an old slide. You will find more updated ones. And here we're back to square one. That is to say, you can see the biological effects, excluding all the others, the biological effects of climate warming. Climate warming, global warming, accelerates, and you can see that what is observed, the pessimistic scenario and the optimistic scenario. Unfortunately, I've added in 2017 they're splitting, and we're going worse. The situation is worse than what expected. And to the side, you can see in detail the impacts that it would have. Here you can see the coral barrier, the desertification, and so on and so forth. This is the effect, the very negative and worrying effect of the change of a human niche and the impact that it has on other species. Here I've summarized it again, and this is something that I wrote, and it was published in the Royal Society, and you observe how the niche change, a niche construction process changes, the examples that I've given you, the beavers, ourselves, so on and so forth, and the ecological transmission or inheritance. And you can see that the niche construction is also the evolution of technologies that I use or that we use. As you will observe, there are impacts. You become natives of a different world. And the same can be repeated several times. Let's recap this part 1 of the lesson. Human species, human beings are great ecosystem engineers. They transform the world and the world transforms them. Niche construction means changing the selective pressure which acts on the others and on ourselves. And then what happens? That we transmit or pass down to our offspring not only genes and ideas, but also ecological changes. And niche construction is, in any case, an evolutionary understanding of the global challenges, which we will be talking about in closing now, and then it'll be the end of my lesson. I will give you 2 examples. Genes and cultures, a close co-evolution, very important. Well, one was the story of lactase, which I've already mentioned. Here you can see the maps once again. Now start looking at it from another point of view. That is to say, let us just talk about human beings, not other animals, because it becomes too complicated. Well, first of all, we have change in culture, and then changes of other things and of genes. Fire is another case in point. What happened? Well, I observed a fire. I saw a natural phenomena. That's what happened with the technology. You always start with observation of a natural event and seeing how the properties of a material or a process change, and then I engineer it. Engineering is the key to it all. That is to say, you start with the engineering of the process. This is a very, very old story, for example, fire, but it also concerns genetic editing that we do together. That is to say, the editing CRISP that we do today. It's the re-engineering of a process that we discovered. Bacteria learned it millions of years ago to defend themselves from viruses. They cut and pasted the DNA. We observed the process and we understood that we were able to take it, engineer it, transform it in a process, in a series of activities that gave a product, and then we adapted it to all cells. And as a result, we have biotechnology. This is what happened. It was happened with fire. Well, we learned how to control it. We took it from nature, and we then managed to keep the fire going. And a lot of time after, we learned how to produce it to light a fire. You never think about it because you always think that clearly this is where technological developments start. No, there's the other side too. What does fire mean? Fire means that I can protect myself from animals, from predators, that I can protect myself from the cold, that the days are longer. It means that I can sit round the fire and tell stories. This changes society. And I can protect myself, as I was saying, from predators. I can live longer. I can eat differently. I can cook. I can cook food. I can use it to cook. I can do as our ancestors learned how to do. I can, for example, heat stones and then I throw them in water and the water boils, and I can boil plants. So, for example, by cooking plants, potatoes, for example, sweet potatoes, which are not good when they're raw, but they become very good when they're cooked. One of the key resources if you are a nomadic population. What does this mean? It means that fire changed our biology, changed our DNA. Another technology that changed our DNA. This is the famous hypothesis that was confirmed by recent data. It was suggested by Richard Wrangham in Harvard. You can see it here. Cooking as a biological trait. It means that cooking is a technology. In fact, there are many engineers that work on this technology, but cooking is also a biological feature, because what do we know today? Well, we are aware of the fact that if we were to decide, some people do, I would disagree. If we decided to have a raw food diet and therefore not eat cooked food, we can do it. But then we need supplements and other things. Why? Because we depend nowadays on cooked food. This was not true in the past. Chimpanzees, for example, have a raw food diet. But curiosity, we carried out an experiment which was very interesting. If you suggest, if you have a chimpanzee in captivity, between a raw food diet and a mixed raw cooked food, the chimpanzees prefer the raw cooked diet, so it means that they too understand the advantage. It's been an evolutionary advantage, but the fact that now our metabolic system has become dependent on cooked food means that from a biological and genetic point of view, we have adapted to a technology. In other words, first we had the technology, and that changed our biology, just like milk and lactase. This is true for a series of other cases. I'll just show them very quickly. You can see here genetic evidence of human adaptation to a cooked diet. Here you can see the genetic evidence of the adaptation over time. So we've discovered that first of all there was the intuition, as I said, of Richard Wrangham. Then we checked the genetics of it, and this proved his hypothesis. This was published in Science, the journal, and very simple. Here you can see it: culture, genes, and human revolution. We know that our genes give us the possibility, the potential, but the other side is from culture to genes. Cultural changes sometimes, many times, retroact on genes. This is true for language, cooking, plant selection, microbiome, and so on. I haven't got time now to detail this, but you can go and check it. And in fact, this is another curious example which I'm going to briefly mention. We discovered that, and this is true only for males, as you know, we have a Y chromosome, while females have an XX combination. The Y chromosome is an odd chromosome because it doesn't correspond to the other, so it tends to become genetically poorer. I'm not going to detail it because it hasn't got a homologous genetic recombination. So our X chromosome, the human one, is particularly poor. Why? Well, because between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, there was a dramatic decline in the diversity level. This was considered a enigma. It had no answer. It was an unanswered question. Why had the Y chromosome become so poor? And here you can see it. This is a Nature communication that was published 3 years ago. It's a very curious story because our Y chromosome was impoverished, or has become more impoverished, because the males that reproduce were 1/17 of what they used to be. It's a bottleneck, as you can see it here. It's terrible. You can see that the reproducer, it's very dangerous in terms of the population because genetic diversity is reduced. So we risked extinction as males. But the social organization was in small groups where very few dominant males mated with more females, and then the social groups fought each other. So in the end, they extinguished or killed the males of the other group. So, if this model will be confirmed, or is confirmed, you can check it in Nature Communication, a cultural change nearly brought us to extinction. So, on war and on the ability to manage testosterone, as males, we have a rather sad story. Here, in fact, you see a genetic feature. Here you can see some details on this and a book called Ultra Society by Turkin. This is another paper which I will leave you and suggest that you look at it, and you discover here that the separation of populations and the discovery of development of new species, in this case they are killer whales, happened for cultural reasons. You know that also these animals have an incredible culture. There's a language which is transmitted from generation to generation. They have passwords, they have symbols, they have a very complex intergenerational social life with the grandparents looking after the grandchildren and so on. But at a point, let's say that a group separates and they give themselves different cultural rules. This is another example of the self-domestication hypothesis. Very interesting. Here you find a summary published in Science, how human beings, as they live together, found it more advantageous to favor the individuals who were more docile, more sociable, more friendly. And this has led to a selection, a social selection, that favored also the traits of the physical features, just as happens in domesticated animals. It's called the domestication syndrome, and it's happened to us, self-domestication. That's where we're different, because we did it on ourselves. And there again, if you don't want to only see the morphological aspect, look at the genetics. And in concluding, because I want to link what I'm saying with the next lesson. As I mentioned earlier on, but we will be seeing it in more detail, you'll be shown this slide in lesson 2 as well. If we modify ecosystems too quickly in a destructive manner, we favor the development of pandemics. Here you see this referred to Ebola, the Ebola virus disease that has been linked to deforestation. That is to say, they developed in places where human beings had modified the environment. So it's very important. Very last case, which I'm going to show you today, which is a bit of a joke since it's the end of the lesson, the last 10 minutes, concerns something which is very, very recent, which we're now studying. So it's something in progress. I haven't got conclusive or final results yet, but it's very interesting, and it's probably very similar to what I've said so far. It's the case of the microbiota. We discovered that industrialized and urbanized countries, us here in Turin, in European cities, American or Chinese cities, we have an gut system, which is a microbiota and which is a system with viruses and bacteria. They've become part of us, bacteria, fungi, all sorts of things. So there's an entire ecosystem in our gut, and which makes it possible for us to live. We've got it in our skin, in our gut. It helps us. It cooperates with us, for example, in digestion. It's very important. And we've discovered that when this inner microbiota becomes much poorer, we then develop diseases, for example, obesity or allergy, or even degenerative diseases such as Parkinson, which depends on biodiversity and in gut biodiversity, intestinal biodiversity. Here you can see, this is 2018, the system has become much poorer in urban areas. It's the adaptation, then we had in the savannah, then we had agriculture, and now the industrial world. And in this paper, there is a suggestion which, that is to say, that we should set up a data bank of biodiversity of the microbiota. Why? Because here you can see this is very interesting, because Italians work on this too, that in native population, for example, the Hasda hunter-gatherers, and people in the Amazon forest too, the microbiota is 3 times the level of biodiversity. There are 3 times as many species in our guts, bacteria and other species, viruses that live in our gut. And this is something we should think about. Why? Well, because it means that there is a connection between the environment, that is to say, living in urban and industrial contexts, and the lack of diversity of our microbiota, and therefore all those consequences it has on diseases and on allergies and obesity and so on. We now know that allergies and autoimmune diseases virtually don't exist in hunter-gatherers, and this is very important and interesting because it means once again that we have changed the world. We live in cities. We have surrounded ourselves of anthropic niches, but this has then had a direct effect on us and on our microbiota, which, amongst other things, is transmitted, which is it's not genetic transmission. It's not given by the genes of our mothers and fathers, but it's rather unusual because we're born, and as we grow in our mothers' bellies, in the contact with our mothers and during breastfeeding and with exposure to the environment, we acquire this microbiota. This is a very interesting and new discovery, which means it's reacquired. This is why the environment in a situation like this is especially important, because I absorb it directly from my mother, from the environment which is around me. So if the environment changes, clearly this will act again on me. And this is why there has been this great impoverishment. And then I'll show you something. You see, this is an image that I've already shown you of the polar bear. At the end of that article, Science, the authors said something very odd. You see, I've put it. In many ways, the loss of our microbial diversity resembles climate change. And you say, well, what does climate change got to do with it? That's a global change, which we're immersed in due to human activities and so on. What greenhouse gases, what has that got to do with my gut, my intestine? But in fact, the metaphor is very clear. The analogy is very clear. And it's exactly what I've told you in the course of this lesson. Today, over 50% of the world's population lives in urban environments, and it's a global one. Europe, it's about 75% of the population. And the forecast is that it will be 85% in the next 20 years. So this means that we have to prepare ourselves to an evolution of that type, where we will change the selective pressures, and these will retroact negatively, in this particular case on us, impoverishing the flora. It's no longer called like that, the fauna and flora, but it's called the microbiota. The microbiome, sorry. This is a very interesting one because you can see that climate change and microbiome, they're all together, and the things that connect them is the evolution, this model. But it also tells you something else, which we haven't seen. These models can be predictive. What does it mean to be predictive? That is to say that in science, it's very important to be predictive. And I'm going to oversimplify, but just to say it quickly. As Charles Darwin and Albert Einstein said, science is like a 3-legged stool. One leg is the description. So as a scientist and as an engineer, I must describe the situation. I must measure. I must understand what is happening. And I must then give it a fundamental description. What is the second leg? The explanation. What is an explanation? It's that faced with all these changes, I have to offer causes, explanations, mechanisms. I'm using words that we will be using again that will account for, explain what I see. Then I have to make predictions, third leg. That is to say, once I've described what I've seen, once I've explained it, therefore I've made suggestions, hypothesis on why, then I have to have a prediction. That is to say, I know that there will be something else. I expect something else to happen. I foresee that some other scientists or I myself will observe a new situation and I make a prediction. So it's not like fortune telling, but is that I predict something so that someone can then check it in the future. The most beautiful example, if you want to study it, is what Albert Einstein said with the general relativity when he also said what the position of the stars would be in an eclipse in 1919, and the great astrologist then discovered. He said, if I am right, if my explanation is correct, general relativity, the space-time curvature, and so on, the theory of gravitation, if I am right, I am then going to say something which is very definite, very precise. The stars will be in another position because the light will be deviated along the space-time curve. This is a very risky thing to say because you might be wrong. And the more accurate it is, the more dangerous it is. But this is what happens with science. We have to make predictions. Engineers too, but in a different way maybe, have to do this because you will quantify, you will explain what you observe on the basis of laws or principles that are already known or investigated, researched, and then you have a design, a product, a plan, but it's a design and you have to monitor it, you have to test it. There are a series of steps to check that it works, and that is another version in practice of prediction, of the predictive value of science. Why am I saying that these models are like this? Because if I learn this and I discover that this is what happens, if this is what happens, I must be able to say that if in 2050 85% of Europeans will live in a city, this and that and the other will happen. And I must expect it. I must expect the impact that this will have. I must foresee the impact that this will have on my health. Preventive programs, One Health is a word that you will hear me use, and you will hear, that is to say, health seen as one, where I am a comprehensive definition, because it means that I understand that my health as a human being exists in an environment. These models are predictive from this point of view. The very last few minutes I have is for a last paradox, which I will use as a link for the next lesson, and this is it. Here you can see. The slide is in Italian, but I'm sure that the foreign students will be able to understand it. There's a very strange paradox in the case of climate change. And here there are also a few books that you can read in Italian or English and which explain this very clearly. That is to say, we have discovered, this is something that I study, we've discovered that there are reasons whereby we find it very difficult to understand climate warming and climate change. Statistics, average, medians are counterintuitive for humans. I'm not justifying those who've had problems with statistics or maths or probability, but we know that there are cognitive reasons whereby many people find it counterintuitive. The mathematical models are not linear, they're on large scale, they're very difficult to understand. If you, for example, tell somebody, you know, that May has been very cold and wet. Why? Because there's global warming. What's global warming got to do with the fact that it rained a lot and it was cold in May, but then you would have to explain everything, explain all the dynamics and so on and so forth. This is a difficulty that exists. Well, we know that this difficulty has evolutionary reasons. Our mind has difficulties that are linked to how it developed. We prefer certain types of explanation as opposed to others. Explanations of proximity, where I see the effect of the actions. While on climate change, these problems, my action will not have a direct, clear, immediate reaction. Very often, the retroaction side effects are very different, and this is difficult to understand. Just as it is difficult to understand average, median, mean as what they mean. It's very difficult for us to understand climate change because our minds have never been used to understand it. We're not ready for it. It's something new, which is causing a displacement. We don't understand how and why, which means that an ethic impact is very difficult. Face news and questioning of science uses this difficulty. And this is a paradox because our mind has evolved in a notion, in an environment of proximity where cause and effect were very close. And we will discuss this in future lessons too. But this is yet another example of this dynamic which I have discussed today. So let us now summarize part 2. Sometimes culture and technology precede genetics, and not vice versa, as we often think, to the point that we have become dependent of our technologies, as for example cooking. That's one case in point. Then we've seen that in ecological inheritance, that is to say, what we transmit or pass down can become an evolutionary trap. That is to say, that the next generation has a cost rather than an advantage. And lastly, in the case of the microbiome, the effects, the negative side effects, are faster than expected. So, the idea, to say it in a nutshell, is that we are niche builders. We have niche constructions, and the more so engineers and architects. You will be champions of this, but these changes have impacts. These are effects that you will measure in the dynamics of your project. You will also have to imagine the effects on the environment, on people's behavior. A building, for example, a facility, a structure will change the habits of people, the social environment, the physical environment, the biological environment, the social environment. All these changes will loop and feed back into us. They will have a change on us, and they will be passed down to the next generation. And we have to, this is an ethical value, we have to undertake to the fact that it should be a positive transmission. We should not see that our offspring live in a worse world, in a world that is worse than ours. So we must, when we're talking about niche construction, we have to consider the context and the global challenges. Why great challenges? Now maybe you understand it. Because one thing and another, we've spoken about great big challenges, environmental changes, climate changes. What should we do? We'll see it next time with technology. How can we conceive, design technologies? Are technologies the only ones that are going to save us, or are there going to be other things too? This is the reason why it's the great big challenge. We're going to be doing something which appears to be simple but requires a new language and a new approach to technology other than the specific cases you'll be applying it to. The suggestion is to have an all-encompassing, all-comprehensive view on what we call distant time. In the next lesson, we will be applying this to the pandemic, and then we'll see the crisis of biodiversity and then technological development as cases to then understand this scenario. So, see you next time.